Hey guys, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, so I'm here with my good friends Yvonne and Sabina, and we're going to talk about the Psyche thread. We're going to do kind of like um, an overview of everything that there is to say about the Psyche thread. And we have three of us here because the Psyche thread is can be quite variable. There can be a lot of different kinds of experiences, and it's good to get some different perspectives on it. So with the other threads, we started kind of differentiating between Psyche thread, the thread of awakening per se, versus other kinds of things that might seem similar that need to be kind of disaggregated or separated out. Um, and Psyche thread, I think one place to start is to just say that we are not talking about um, the kinds of psychological um, challenges or materials that come up in the process of spiritual practice. A lot of people have difficulties, memories, traumas, all sorts of different kinds of challenging experiences, destabilizing experiences, even mental health crises that come up, you know, um, during spiritual practice or during an awakening process. Um, And so we're not talking about that, although that might be related. It might be um, something that comes up during a psyche thread awakening process. That's not the psyche thread per se. And so a psyche thread awakening process is I would describe it as being an awakening process where the kind of psychological materials that we were just talking about um, are not epiphenomena that are coming up that are sort of resolved in order to get back to the awakening process. So if you're in an emptiness awakening process, those kinds of things will come up and it'll be the mission will be to purify those things to see how they're all constructs, to see how they're all stories, to see through them and get back to the emptiness perspective. If you're in a oneness style awakening, you're gonna, those things are gonna come up and it's gonna be, you're gonna surrender to them, release them into the wholeness, the sacredness, the divinity, the oneness, the God, the universe, the cosmos. They're gonna be seen as being all part of this process. If you're in a energy style awakening, it might be you're gonna process these kinds of things energetically. Um, but here these kinds of events that are coming up um, are not in a psyche thread awakening. They're not sort of like the sideshow that needs to be managed in order to get back to the awakening. They are the awakening. They are somehow like central, critical parts of the awakening process, and that's a whole different kind of approach that some styles of spirituality advocate and some people are more drawn towards, some people are more naturally inclined towards. And so these are things like um, I think Jungian style exploration. There's lots of different kinds of awakening style practices that are based on Jungian ideas, having to do with whether it's transpersonal psychology or archetypal work or individuation as the goal. So that's one whole category. There's offshoots now. There's internal family systems and other kinds of psychological frameworks that use kind of Western psychology terminology. Then there's shamanism. There's um, other forms of kind of traditional indigenous practices that use this style of awakening or that move in this direction. Um, and so the language can be really different between the different traditions, between the different frameworks that people have. People's experiences can be really different because what's in the psyche and what comes up can be um, radically different. Um, and I guess the last thing I'll say is that we're not discouraging people from doing psychotherapy for therapeutic purposes or, work for healing purposes is really important. But we are talking about something different, which is an awakening process where the psyche becomes the main, the movement of unconscious materials into consciousness becomes the main event or the main thrust of the awakening process. So how's that for an introduction? What do you guys think? What would you add or change or modify or say differently than I just did?
I guess it's always good to repeat what we understand when we say awakening,
Yeah.
because this is the key, right? To differentiate the shadow material and the trauma stuff from the awakening process. So on this thread, like on any other thread, it involves the three dimensions of shift in perception, shift in identity, and shift in worldview. And by saying this, you can see that when you work with trauma or when you do like deconditioning or healing work, it doesn't mean that you change your perception or you change your worldview or you change your sense of identity. That can still remain the same, and you're just healing the stuff that circles around it. And so I think this is a good like way to look at it. And often on any thread, only backwards you can really say, haha, that was a thread. So in the beginning, a lot of things seems to be epiphenomenal. So just sideshows, and then suddenly the sideshow becomes the main show. But that often can just be seen like retrospective, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a great point. And it also applies, I think, to shamanism or indigenous practices as well, where people are engaging in shamanic work, let's say, in order to be happier, in order to be more balanced emotionally, in order to like I don't know, be wealthy or like to somehow change the reality, that they're living, the material reality that they're living in. And none of those would qualify as awakening either, right? Because they're not fundamentally transforming the sense of self, the perception, meaning like different states of consciousness, right? And they're not really transforming somebody's worldview. They're kind of accommodating to this worldview, making me work better in this world. Yeah, great point. What do you think, Sabina? For starting points, are we missing anything or
No, I was just gonna say the same thing. It can be like tendency first, and maybe being prone to the darker side, and maybe because of trauma early in life or at birth, like it was with me. And then in hindsight, you just see like how it turns into a thread, how identity changes or your whole worldview shifts. So exactly, yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
Right. And so all of those shifts don't have to happen all at once. It can be like, there's this sort of lifelong kind of orientation in this direction, and then maybe somewhere along the way the worldview opens up and then later there's a real transformation in consciousness, in sense of self. And then you look back and you're like, oh, I can now see the whole thing has been a thread all along. And but now it becomes sort of like like a magnet, right? It just kind of pulls you in to, once these three shifts have happened, then, the thread really kind of draws you in and it's really kind of becomes, um, in a way, inescapable, fascinating, right?
Yeah, and especially with the unconscious thread, I find that it kind of pulls the rug from underneath you. it pulls you in often, like, and you kick and scream, but there's nothing you can do actually. You're just
Yeah.
going down to where it's really dark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and we should make a note there because you just said unconscious thread
Mhm.
and we we played around with this a little bit because you guys both speak German and you're translating Multidharma into German. And then the model, I call it Psyche Thread, but in German, that word somehow didn't make sense, and you guys
Yeah.
decided to go with unconscious thread, which is funny because that's actually the very first time I gave the
Mhm.
talk about the threads. That's what I called this thread. I wound up using Psyche because I thought it was I don't know, just a more kind of all-encompassing word than unconscious in English, but you guys found that that worked best in German, right? Just given all the terminology. I think actually it's really interesting because, so Jung himself and so many of the kind of like founding kind of figures in psychology, spoke or wrote in German. So I think it's interesting. There's probably some really fascinating linguistic analysis that we could do there. But yeah, so if you slip and say unconscious thread, I don't want people to be confused. We're talking about psyche thread. Unconscious thread is a perfectly fine synonym for the same thing.
Yeah, and another thing I was thinking about when preparing for this talk here is that when we look at trajectories, because what we have in the thread is the trajectory, right, of deepening into the awakening. Um, where is the starting point? And I know from myself and also from others that often when you have a very strong psyche thread, you started at a different starting point, like I say, usually. Because often it feels like it's already open when you come into the world, because perception, in my case, has been different just right from the beginning. And my way of seeing the world, of perceiving unconscious material in myself, in others, catching up things that are invisible, but for me, they were very alive as a child. They have already been here. And usually, when we have like a first awakening, often you come from I'm this person, this is my body, this is my thoughts, this is my feelings. And now I have an awakening and I see, oh no, this is not me, there's more than that. But for me and for many other psyche threader, this already is clear. I'm not this body. I'm just so much more than that because perception is so open, like the sense gates are more open and whatever comes in as information from different realms, if you want to call them, or ancestors, or it's hard for me to even put words around it because I'm not coming from a certain tradition, so I don't know even how to call them. But to perceive things differently since childhood, that was just normal. So for many, this may be the first shift, like from being this person fixed in this body, opening up to this other realms. Whereas for myself, this was already the starting point. So I think that's also interesting to look at when we look at the trajectories, especially in the psyche thread.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Psyche threaders, to use that phrase, I like that phrase. Psyche threaders. Um, Turns out we were kind of weird all along, right? Like,
Yeah.
um, yeah. So I myself, I mean, I was, I have been drawn to like magic, the occult, particularly the way that I had a lot of different sort of dabblings and stuff when I was in high school and college, but I kind of landed on Asian style indigenous practices, spirit management and spirit healing and so forth as a thing that I was very fascinated by, very interested in. Kind of circled around that practice without really going super deep into it, but kind of had a lot of knowledge and experience and so forth around that. You know, and then in the awakening process, those kinds of things became much more central. But yeah, sort of had been there all along since the beginning. What about you, Sabina? You're nodding your your head. Were you weird as a kid
Yeah.
too?
Oh, that's my second name actually. So maybe it was because of like the trauma when I was born, because I almost died. And I feel like it opened up the senses in a different way. And from very early childhood on, I would have clairvoyant uh, senses, and I would see the unseen worlds, invisible worlds. And I remember my parents telling me I was 3 years old and in the garden seeing my dead great grandmother. So I was always kind of like not like the norm, you would say, but same like Yvonne said, it was so natural. It never dawned on me that this is not the way it's supposed to be. This it was just completely natural as breathing. So and still
And what I also guess is like when you come from an indigenous culture where it's normal that you talk to spirits and you have the shaman and he's also doing like shamanic work with ancestors and stuff, for them that's their normal worldview. As for us in the Western world with a more materialistic view, this is not normal. And this is also just like normal. What's that, right? It's just a word. But to see that I like to talk about the Psyche thread as the iceberg. Like you have the tip of the iceberg, which is visible, and this is just the things we think to know. And then there is so much underneath that's in the unconscious. And it's even broader than just our family system. It's just like everything, like you just said, Pierce, about archetypes and all the stuff that's not just stored here in my little psyche, but just psyche in general, like this, the human psyche itself is holding so much material that is part of a worldview or is not, depending on where you grow up, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, and culture is going to play a big role in the psyche thread as it opens up, right? All
Yeah.
the cultural shadows and cultural programming and so forth is going to come out to the surface as part of that process. Um, so 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 the three of us are talking about how we kind of like inclined in this direction maybe all along. We mentioned clairvoyance, we mentioned like spirits and other kinds of experiences. But some people get thrown into this, right? They maybe lived in a completely conventional materialistic, worldview and then get thrown into the psyche thread, awakening process, and suddenly they're realizing, oh, wait a minute, the reality that I had is now shifting, right? I have this change in worldview. But one way or another, you're gonna have this worldview shift. Either it was there to begin with, or it's gonna come online at some point. Um, and but again, the worldview, the way people language it, the way people describe it, can differ from tradition to tradition. Yeah, if you grew up in a indigenous North American, South American, African tradition, you're gonna talk in one way. If you grew up in the West and you grew up with like, um, clairvoyance, let's say, you're gonna have a whole different language that you use for that. I was inspired by Asian stuff, so I had a different framework for it than you did. So the languaging doesn't really concern us here because what we're trying to do is develop a general theory of this style of awakening. So we want to include all of those variations, and we want to, of course, they're different in many ways, but we want to sort of like um, understand them as being part of a larger family of awakening styles, or of the psyche awakening. Um, so let's talk about the shift. So that was a shift in worldview. Let's talk about the shift in perception, or in, so kind of like your states of consciousness changing and so forth. You two have already mentioned a little bit about that, the kinds of consciousness, states of consciousness that you had experienced earlier. Is there more to say there about that? I mean, I could share myself. Not only did I have this worldview of, spirits and kinds of other things I was interested in from a young age, but also had weird perceptual or weird kind of altered states of consciousness type experiences since I was very young too. So I had kind of visions. I had moments where I felt like I was talking with, different entities. I had various kinds of weird sort of altered states of consciousness that would come. Uh, I mean, I did experiment a little bit with some psychedelics early on in like when I was in college, and I decided that those weren't for me. I had some experiences like that, but then I also had just kind of, without any kind of chemical assistance could have through certain kinds of practices or experiences could have moments where things were disrupted or changed pretty significantly. Uh, let's say I was inclined towards those kinds of experiences from a younger age. What about you guys? Is that anything you want to add there?
Well, what I noticed is that with the first awakenings on the other threads, there was this inclination towards the above, to the transcendent. And I would, with the clairvoyant senses, would see the angels and the spirit guides and the heavenly creatures. And when the darker stuff opened up, I would start to see like dark entities, demons, and things like that, which had never seen before, which was a bit scary at first. And it was just finding my way into that and finding context again to what was happening. And so that I would say was a major perceptual shift, because suddenly it wasn't all love and light and roses.
Mhm.
I was seeing quite dark creatures and interacting with them too. So,
And I guess one of the main differences between Sabina and myself having the Psyche thread is I never have been in touch with entities, interestingly. Like some people externalize their psyche material and they see it outside in form of angels or demons or dragons or whatever. I never had entities. For me, it was more like I like to use the movie Inception because many people know the movie Inception. It's where they go into the dreams of people and walk into like the dreams of the people. And when I saw the movie, I was like, this is what my childhood was like. Because what happened to me is that since from early age, I was like I don't even know how that happened. It was automatic. I couldn't do anything about it. I would have visions, or I would not even have visions. I would go into different lives of different people at different times, different places, completely unknown to me. And it just happened, and I could feel what they feel, I could see what they see, and then I came back, and my perception was always an internal perception, never outside of myself. But also my identity wasn't defined. This is me in this body, but the me was the thing that was floating around in these different like worlds and lives from people. And so this body, when I came back to the body, it felt often more like being in a prison. So I didn't identify with the body as this is me, but this is the prison I'm in. And I knew from my experiences that I was something else. I was free. I could wander around, walk around, and whatever different things and stages in lives. And so and as Sabina said before, I thought everyone did that. I thought that was normal. So it took me a while to understand that this is not normal, that not everyone had that possibility. Or yeah, it's a curse and a blessing at the same time, because when I was very young, I often ended up in lives that were involved in war or cruel sceneries. And it was very overwhelming for myself as a child. And later on, it was also a gift because I did a lot of writing, and all my inspiration, all my stories, I didn't write them. I just went to that realms and just wrote down what came in. So that was so normal to myself that I never would have thought about this as something related to different state of consciousness or awakening or whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So that gets us into the shifts in identity, right? The third kind of shift. And so again, you're pointing to the fact that for some people it's like you're like a native psyche threader, right? You're like born, or I don't know what, early childhood, you have this kind of like you're already in sort of a psyche thread context, right? So because you already had that kind of identity shift. And for other people, it happens later where, that maybe it's like, oh, I'm me and I'm this individual entity, or I'm this individual person, and then suddenly there's a some kind of radical shift that takes place where I see that I'm not. So you are already kind of in the position of seeing, um, yourself as something different than just Yvonne, right? From the beginning. Um, yeah. So for me, that shift came a lot later. It's kind of I don't know. I'm kind of prone to like more dramatic bells and whistles kind of experiences. So yeah, for me that came much later, and it was a very dramatic kind of shift that happened when after significant opening of the all the other threads actually. The psyche thread came online sort of last, but when it came online with um, a big perceptual shift, big sort of like visions and kind of a lot of spilling out of the unconscious material of the psyche into awareness. But it also came with a big, profound kind of explosive shift in identity, all at once, kind of crashing down. So I don't know, two very different experiences, right? So I want to point out how differently these shifts can be experienced. But what about you, Sabina? What's
Hmm.
your identity shift story?
Yeah, it was a series of trauma and losses that kind of like made my whole life tumble and fall into darkness, into a dark night that lasted almost 3 years. And when I was confronted with my own uh, stuff that I was avoiding when I was trying to ascend, you know. And then also the collective came up too, all the pain, the suffering of humanity. Actually, it was quite overwhelming at times. And then when I came out of that, one day it was just over. I felt that it started slowly. I could feel that there was something huge that was roaming like in the earth underneath me, which I couldn't grasp. And it started stirring in me too. And then there was like more of a sudden opening into some void, first like a black hole, but it wasn't like the emptiness void of nothingness or stillness or like a cool darkness. It was more like a sea, a dark sea, warm like a womb and magnetic. It was kind of like pulling me in there, and I so badly wanted to go there. It was a bit scary too, but it felt like home, and it had a feminine touch to it, and that then exploded into a in an identity shift. I saw myself as, or experienced myself as the daughter of this, now coming into this into Earth and at the end of times to help humanity, with yeah, whatever. So yeah, just the first part of that.
This is great. So, Yvonne, you sort of like had this identity sort of there from the beginning. I had a big shift prior to going down into all the stuff that you just talked about, Sabina, but your shift came at the end after having gone down through all of those layers, right? So that's interesting just to show how variable it is between people where these shifts come. And like Yvonne was saying earlier, you can only really identify, okay, this has been a psyche thread, and I see where these shifts happen. retrospectively, right? You could looking back at the whole trajectory, you can see how it all fit together. You might not have known at the time, you know, even if you had read Multidharma at the time, you might not have known that you were sort of on this thread when it first started, right? So, but in retrospect, it becomes really clear. Um, you want
And
to
what
say
I
something?
think is really interesting, especially like in my trajectory, but maybe for others too, is when we talk about Psyche Thread, the bottom of it is like everything's a projection of my mind, right? And
Yeah.
for me,
Let-
I could see that very clearly with all I just said, but there was one thing I never doubted it to be a projection. There was always like, this is the truth. And this was the thing that was holding everything together. And for me, that was the belief that I don't want to be here. I always felt like not just weird, I felt like I'm landed in the wrong planet. It's just for me, the whole journey, the general journey started with how do I get out of here? And I never thought about this to be a projection of my mind. And when that scrambled, that was the huge shift for me because then this was the cornerstone of my identity that I never questioned to be a projection of the mind. And when that fall away, like the whole thing just blowed up. It was kind of amazing that even though you have clarity about projection, like everything is a projection of my mind, there are some things that you still like, you know, keep away from it because this is untouchable. This is truth. And it was kind of when I realized that it was kind of obvious that's never been true either. But for the first 40 years of my life, that seemed so true.
Yeah. So let's come back to that because I want to hold on to I want to sort of walk down through the psyche thread layers and get to that sort of end point with the last holdout. But before we kind of like go down into the psyche thread, it occurs to me because a lot of people could listen to what we've just talked about, the worldview, the identity, the perception, the changes in perception and so forth that we've just been talking about. Um, some people will point to that and say, yeah, that kind of stuff can happen when you're doing awakening process, when you're doing like, meditation or self-inquiry or some other kind of spiritual practice, and it's all just like delusional, right? It's just all like a mental stuff that's coming up that you should kind of like just see through or ignore. um Other people are listening to what we're saying and saying those people are crazy, like they just have a mental illness, right? Like these are obviously psychological anomalies or something like that. um So I want to respond to those kind of like doubts or criticisms or questions. And one way I would do that is just to say like if that is what you're hearing when you're hearing what we're talking about, then that shows that you're located in a different thread. Because if you're listening to what we're saying and saying that all of that is just like, concepts that need to be seen through, then you're located in an emptiness thread. And if you're hearing everything we're saying and saying, oh, that these people are just, you know, have a mental problem, then you're really firmly located in the daily life thread, what I call the daily life thread. And viewing the psyche thread from those threads, you can have those perspectives. Um, when you're in a psyche thread awakening, like you don't have an option. Like you are you are immersed in the realities that we're describing here. Um, and what we're talking about here is a form of awakening, different traditions, different practices, different awakening experiences that happen within this framework, right? Within this reality that we're talking about here. I don't know. Would you say that differently, or would you how would you guys address the hypothetical critic that I'm talking about?
Yeah, I second what you already said is that if someone can not totally relate to this, you're coming from a different viewpoint. You have a different perspective on the process, and to be fair, while in it, I mean, I didn't have any idea that this was about awakening, and especially this part, I would have never thought to be part of an awakening process. So I can totally understand. But while you're in it, it makes up all your reality. This is how it is. And yeah, there's no doubt about it. And I would also say like while this can bring up phases of destabilization and you're not being functional for a while, which actually never happened to me. So I was always able to do about my daily life. But when you see in the long run that your life is more stable, or you're getting the context you need to operate in daily life, I would say that this is not indicative of a mental health crisis. So just see how this turns out, even if it can be bumpy at times.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just for all the threads, if you haven't experienced something, or just also in daily life, if you haven't experienced how chocolate tastes, of course you can explain to someone else how chocolate tastes, but it's a difference if you taste it or if you just hear about it. So that's just a general thing, I guess. And it's always good that to know that also multidharma, also the threads are just a concept. Like emptiness often is like, this is not a concept. I know all the other concepts, but they're not questioning the concept of emptiness, right? So at a certain point, you will also question the concept of emptiness. And so of course you will knock on every concept. And yes, it's a concept, it's a framework, it's a context we use to frame things. And in the end, yeah, do they exist? Who knows? What we can say is that we all had our experiences with them.
Yeah, and where we're going, you've already alluded to kind of the bottom of the psyche thread is to recognize all of the stuff that we're talking about, but also all of reality is actually being projected by the psyche. So anybody who has that kind of like ontological objection, will be satisfied in the end, by right. Um, but Sabine, I think you said something important, which is, that these experiences can be radically destabilizing and very difficult for people at various times and places in the psyche thread and awakening process. And it is possible to cause, or to have some kind of real problems arise along the way. And I think it's important for people to, not go all the way to the other extreme. So one extreme is to look at any of this and say it's all just crazy. That's one extreme. But the other extreme is to go into the psyche thread process and just like, accept it all and just go all in and kind of, wind up in a mental health crisis because of, lack of balance in how you're approaching it, let's say. I think something you said that's really important is yeah, about the kind of the value of paying attention to like functionality in daily life and how other people, how you're getting along with other people and other people are seeing you, I think can be an important mirror as you're exploring some of these things. And if you're really finding yourself to be destabilized to the point of not of really not being functional, or people around you really feeling like there's something off or something that's you know not healthy. um I would say those should be big red flags that you should take seriously, and that you should pay a lot of attention to safety while you're on this thread, just like all the other threads. I talk about safety, I talk about practices and perspectives that can keep you from landing yourself in a spiritual emergency. I would say on the psyche thread, they're very important to maintain. Um, so can we talk about like safety a little bit, like safety practices? What kinds of things you guys would advocate for somebody who's either excitedly jumping into the Psyche thread or else being sucked down by, the the Psyche thread in a way that's a little bit beyond their control? What do you guys what do you guys teach people to do in terms of kind of basic safety nets to have in place as they go?
But for me, everything in my own process has been about the nervous system
Mm.
because when you face these experiences on the Psyche thread, you need a very stable nervous system or one that is able to regulate easily. Because if not, it crashes you down. And so everything that helps you to regulate your nervous system, like simple exercises for the vagus nerve or whatever it might be, grounding is always helpful, of course. And if not, I always find it super helpful to address trauma, like in a therapeutic setting. The less trauma you have on your shoulders, the easier you get through the Psyche thread.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Um, so I think that's great advice. I also advocate having a really powerful um, spirit ally or spiritual guide or um, divine protector. So this may or may not make sense depending on how people's psyche thread experience happens. But if you are dealing with entities, if you're dealing with, powers and traveling to different dimensions and so on and so forth, if that is part of the psyche thread, if there's, invisible forces, that or ancestral, influences or things like that, then one thing I think to cultivate is some kind of relationship with either a divine being or a really far back ancestral protector, in order to have a source of protection and security and safety and strength when you need it. So, you know, I mean, it could be anything, but I would steer people towards unambiguously positive figures. So, like, somebody like Virgin Mary or Guan Yin from Buddhism, or an ancestor like grandparent or somebody who's really has you in their heart and in their interests. um, yeah, and then when the things get going, when things get tough, you have some source of strength that you can call on, or some source of protection you can call on. Anyway, that's one. So kind of offerings or prayers or rituals of various types in order to cultivate those relationships is something I think is smart to do if your psyche thread involves entities and powers and so forth. What about you?
Mm. It's interesting. I had these like contacts and supportive networks like Mother Mary and so on earlier, but once the Psyche thread kicked in, it was all gone. God was gone. Every supportive system was gone, and I was like facing all these demons and everything all by myself. And when I was telling my Buddhist friends later about it, they were scared, like, you go in there without your protectors. And I'm like, yeah, well, there was no one. And
Yeah.
so what helped me was like a radical surrender and the willingness to completely die into this. And this is the only thing that really was the guiding light through all of this. And luckily, the nervous system was able to do this and getting me into the processes and unwinding what was coming up there and finding that it's self-liberated or integrated, either or, and that I always got safely out the other end and kind of like transformed. It was never the same that went into the process that came out the other side. So I was completely on my own there.
Yeah. Yeah, good. So we've got some directions for people to go in order to sort of cultivate a safety net, right? So whether it's external mirroring or, entities or practices that you're doing yourself or just a like a mindset. These are important to have in place. Um, so then maybe we can talk about like deepening down into the thread. So now we've got the safety this we're having various experiences. We've got the safety net in place, and now we're gonna sort of like um, enter into the thread, engage with the materials, and deepen down into the thread. So uh, the way that I describe that or talk about that is kind of using the metaphor of layers, that there's multiple layers that sort of unfold. And it's not like every person sees every layer. It's not like every layer has to be kind of dealt with in equal measure. But just kind of generally speaking, the way that the kinds of things that come up for people in the psyche thread. And remember, it's things that were previously unconscious moving to the foreground and becoming, coming into your awareness. And so we can include here um, a lot of personal psychological material, whether it's memories or traumas or other kinds of, repressed things that have been in the shadows that come forward. So there's that whole category. Then there's the um, particularly birth and prenatal stuff, I think maybe is worth kind of being its own category because this is all pre-verbal and it's of a different flavor than the stuff that is more kind of like conceptual in memory. So there, that's really deeper in some respects. And then if you go kind of like one layer down, you're in the ancestral, intergenerational kinds of issues and traumas and ways that your psyche has been sculpted and shaped by your family, your inheritance. Going further than that, you could say perhaps for some people, there's like past lives is a reality that comes up in this in the psyche thread, and that material comes to the foreground. Um, if we go down like the material biological um, conditioning that one has, as an animal, as a mammal, as an organism, as a living, being on the planet Earth. Then there's all the kind of interconnections with other beings and other um, forms of life on Earth, right? The Earth, the planet as a living organism itself. You can go even further down. There's elemental stuff like earth, water, fire, wind, kind of, making up my body and part of and all of nature. You can you can go further down and you can find sort of like maybe divine architecture, divine planning, spiritual um, maps and plans and um, grids and networks, right? That I'm trying to use neutral terminology, right? Whether these are astral beings or nature spirits or divine entities of various different types. Of course, that depends on the tradition. Um, you keep going down, there's all kinds of, cosmic beings, gods, goddesses, etc. And so all of that whole sort of like stack of possible aspects, um, uh, things that might come forward, as archetypes or as symbols or as entities. You might actually see the entities in front of you. You might feel energies. You might hear words. You might see visions. You might, in some way they're coming forward out of the shadow of the unconscious material and becoming conscious. And you see like, oh, I now can really see how this thing, whatever it is really shaping my reality or has been um, shaping who I am or shaping the world around me in ways that I had not been aware of before. Um, so then there's practices you can do to like lean into that in various different ways. And of course, practices are going to be different. So before we get into practices, what do you guys, what do you have to add about like the layers or the ways that this kind of unfolds and comes into your awareness? Is there something to add there?
I would say that first, like you already said, you don't have to experience all of the layers, and also you don't have to experience them in a linear fashion in any way. And when looking back, I would say for me it was like an alternation, like starting from the more collective or archetypal levels, and then switching to the body, the cellular memory, and then back to the ancestral and back to the body. And so it was kind of like coming from the broader context, switching or intertwining with bodily integration or coming up of stuff from the body itself, and then coming down more and more. And it was also about the extremes, like life and death. It was about dying and being born.
Mm.
So it can have like maybe also a individual theme, that you can find, and a specific pattern how this unwinds for you. And maybe it doesn't need a pattern, but that's what I noticed, that it did have a pattern in some way. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and to me, it's also felt like it felt like something completely out of my control. Like once it opened up, like you just said, Sabina, it was just showing up in different ways, and so it was more about allowing or surrendering up to everything that was showing up, and then at a certain point, not even labeling or naming the things anymore. So at the beginning, there was still the idea, oh yeah, this is trauma and this is this and this is that. And at the end, it's like a big dance or twirl of different layers all together. And it felt more like a stream I was just drawn into and couldn't even, maybe things were happen simultaneously even. Like time and space in this as well, like they got lost through experiencing these kind of things.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Great. So, so what kind of practices were you guys doing? Like, it sounds like a lot of this, and me too, a lot of this kind of came up spontaneously, just suddenly sort of, I was already doing meditation practice and yoga practice and other kinds of practices for other threads. And this material started kind of coming up into the other threads practices, right? So then over time, what I wound up doing was kind of developing a separate container for Psyche Thread practice, right? So I had the other modules in place, and then I sort of like added a Psyche Thread practice module in order to give a space for the material to come up and to work with it within a Psyche Thread kind of way. So I was more structured, I would say, in terms of like developing practices and organizing them. I mean, I'm, as a scholar of religion, I like for a long time have been interested in this stuff and kind of have resources in that respect and have a certain way of thinking about things that comes from my background. So that maybe that makes sense that I was like that, very organized. And um, I don't, I do want to say it didn't feel in control at all. One metaphor I've said is it kind of felt like I was trying to land a plane that was on fire. Both engines were out, and it's like, I'm coming into this like very mountainous area and trying to land this plane. It felt like very out of control. But the way that I went about trying to provide a framework for it was a little bit more um, structured, let's say, rather than just like allowing it to just take over, all aspects of my life. So there was a specific time and place where I really leaned into Psyche Thread work. Not to say that it wasn't there at other times. It was, but I was able to at other times just completely function completely normally and if something would come up, I'd be like, okay, I'll see you later, at at the proper time. I'll see you later. And we'll look at that in more depth, right? So I had a little more structure to my day like that. How about you guys? Did you have any kind of intentional practices or practice time, or was it more fluid than that?
I'm amazed at what you just shared. I mean, what a great structured way to go about this. Since I was all by myself in this, and I didn't have any uh, I hadn't learned anything to prepare me for this, or I wasn't even aware of nervous system regulation. It was completely intuitive. And but somehow the process knew what it needed. So it could be like working with the elemental forces of nature, at one point, or like uh, uh, uniting with like fire or earth or water or whatever. So more the shamanic um, uh, experience, or I would let the body move and do its thing and get the kinks out of the system or integrate them, whatever. Um, or like I already said, the surrendering to whatever came up, but also what in looking back, the other threads were helping out with the psyche thread. So, especially when there was braiding, it was helpful, for example, to see that the dark stuff that was coming up was able to be experienced as divine or mm, sacred simultaneously, or like seeing the energetics of the material that was coming up, and then kind of like transmuting it or um, dissolving it or whatever. So it was a mixture, completely intuitive. So I didn't have any idea or plan.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Mm.
think I spoke about my like containers or modules of practice as being separate, and that they were. Um, but yeah, the braiding process, the bleeding over of one into the other, and the sort of mutual support that one gave to the other, definitely crossed those lines for sure. And yeah, so what what conceptually might have been sort of separate containers, or the practices were different practices, actually the insights or the experiences became quite blended, and eventually the whole thing just kind of collapsed into one, where it was all sort of, all four threads were there during all four times. Yeah. What about you, Yvonne?
Well, for me, there has been no practice because there has been no knowledge about what was going on in the first place, and there was no practice and no teacher or tradition. And there was just the also an intuitive call for surrender. So I'd say my whole path actually is just a path of surrender, has always been. And as the opposite, resisting everything that was showing up. So I was basically fighting with the material, like I don't want this and this needs to go away. When can I finally leave? And the solution always came when I was not really willing to surrender, but there was no other choice.
Yeah.
So for me, it has always been like it seems to be that I'm very stubborn in a way. When there was still a little choice, I could argue and bargain with life, I would try. But then at a certain point, there wasn't any possibility left. So I had to surrender, not because I wanted to, because there was no other choice. And this basically is my whole trajectory, I'd say, in the Psyche thread, generally speaking. And now guiding others through this material, of course, now I know the modalities is like IFS, like you said, internal family system. I find very helpful, like everything that helps you also to befriend your parts, to surrender to whatever shows up in your experience. These kind of things are the major things I now teach.
Yeah. Great. So yeah, so we'll on the website on multidharma.net we have like some recommendations for books and other things. And I don't know that people necessarily need to take my recommendations on that because I think you both of you are what both of you are saying is true that you kind of intuitively will find the kinds of practices that are called for depending on what your particular flavor of Psyche Thread and what particular layer you're working on. And it may be that, I mean, for me, it was, I did a lot of reading. I had a lot of background knowledge, but I did a lot of reading. I collected a lot of tools and a lot of different practices from different places that were extremely helpful. I think for me, the whole thing was colored more, let's say, in like a palette of more like indigenous practices, uh, and shamanistic practices, and also some like intentional ancestral work. So those are the kind of and also a free movement. It's kind of just allowing the body to move around. I think Sabina, you already mentioned that too. So those were kind of like the main ingredients. But I tried all kinds of things. I experimented with all kinds of things. I landed on these that really worked for me. But I would say I was also guided towards those intuitively. I would say in my case, it was more like the entities that I was engaging with taught me which practices to use. They like told me do this and I would do it, right? So it was a little more like that. But yeah, I would say people should be open to experimenting with different things and they'll find the things that work for them rather than having be prescribed by me or by you or by anybody else.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly what you said just now is that if you have externalized material, entities or whatever, and you find a way to communicate, and there's a lot of wisdom there that can also be of help in this downwards spiral, and which is exactly what I did. Like it was a lot about communication, getting context without needing to know if this was awakening or whatever. But this was very, very helpful. So if you have access to that and if it's externalized, that can be very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, and I like what you said, Yvonne, about IFS too, because something like IFS or say shamanism in my case, it's like it's not a specific technique, it's more of like a framework for kind of engaging with this material, right? It provides sort of like a guiding orientation or framework for understanding what's going on and engaging with it in some way. And then the specifics of the practices and how you do that are kind of less are kind of interchangeable, right? What matters is getting a kind of getting some kind of framework that allows you to work with this stuff and not be overwhelmed by it, not be confused, and not be sort of um, yeah, just kind of spinning in circles. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the Psyche thread is cultivating the attitude of welcoming and surrendering. That's the key. However you get there, but to me, that was the key to learn to surrender, to have the attitude of welcoming whatever it is, however it shows up, however long it wants to stay. Like you stop asking questions. When will this go away? What does this even mean? Where does it come from? All these questions will fall apart through the journey because then you don't care anymore why and how and because it is and all you do is just be with it and surrender it.
Great. Yeah. So yeah, so the two of you have really emphasized surrender. I also I completely agree with that being sort of at the end of the day, that's the lesson of the Psyche Thread. So let's talk about let's talk about what we're surrendering to because um so here we are working down through these layers and the things that were previously unconscious are moving to the foreground in whatever way they're moving to the foreground. They're appearing in whatever way they're appearing. We mentioned they appear as entities, they appear as visions, as sounds, they appear as feelings, they appear as emotions. We didn't mention this, but they also can appear like out in external reality. It seems somehow like for many people, uh, life or the like our environments or our surroundings or our families or our workplaces or whatever start to orchestrate somehow our psyche thread awakening, that things happen in the outside world that are just like so perfectly calibrated to trigger our deepest fears, or the things in the outside world happen that are so perfectly organized to like bring something up for us that we start to also experience kind of some um connection between the psyche and the material world as well. Um, but in one way or another, this material is coming up, coming up, coming up. And um, this is what you were alluding to earlier, Yvonne, and it's kind of the where you realize it. It can be at the beginning of the thread, it can be in the middle, it can be at the end, but at some point, what you realize, if the psyche thread is a psyche thread awakening and not just a different kind of process, but if it's an awakening process, if it's a psyche thread awakening, it will show you at some point that uh how do we want to say this? That everything you thought you were, and all of the control and the agency and the power and the the decision making and that you have in the world and all of the world itself, all of that you thought was something that you were doing, um, turns out that all of it is a product of this unconscious material. That so this is an awakening path because the ego collapses on this path, but it doesn't collapse because you see through it. It doesn't collapse because it's part of, a larger whole. It doesn't collapse, in an energetic fashion. The ego collapses because you see that it never existed in the first place, because all of this is just being kind of orchestrated by the unconscious layers of your psyche in some way or another. Um, how you realize that is really different from person to person. I mean, some people are like, "Oh, I thought I was Pierce, but actually it turns out like, the ancestors are doing this and the, astral beings are doing that and my past life is responsible for this and my cultural conditioning is responsible for that." So it seems, these parts, like you mentioned, and using IFS terminology, like there's like the cohesive idea that I am me breaks into all of these parts, and each one of those parts seems autonomously doing this thing, and it's sort of like where's the Pierce in any of this? And you try to find like, oh well, I must be the space in which all of this is happening, or I must be this little piece over here, or I must be that little piece over there. The ego kind of scrambles to establish itself somewhere. Um, but in the end, the psyche thread is showing you that there is no self in there. There is no doer. There is no ego in there. Um, yeah, you guys riff on that for a little bit. How would you add to that?
Okay. Okay, then I'll start.
Mm, yeah, yeah.
For me, it showed up like it was kind of like coming full circle. Like I shared earlier, there was this not wanting to be here, this fear of living in this dark place, this dark world with all of this. And what I realized along the path a couple of times actually is that all of this darkness that I was seeing out in the world, or that was like projected by my psyche as externalized entities that were like attacking me, for example, was just my own projections. It was just my own psyche. And this was profound because in the first round, it kind of like took away the fear of life. It was the for the first time the ability to really be in the body and to be okay with being here. So that was one part, and I would say that the last round was like seeing that all these extremes that this psyche thread was showing, like between light and dark and death and life, um, that they were all like in a way and ecstatically the same. The taste of being alive, and everything else was an add-on by my psyche. So this is kind of like, in short, how it played out for me. So
Yeah. Yvonne, you already mentioned this kind of
Mhm.
this
But this
this
was not the bottom for me, actually. This was the beginning for
yeah, yeah.
me. So starting with this, what I wanted to add to the terms you used, like the ego or the self, is just the identity. You
Mm,
usually have one piece left of identity that you don't question.
yeah.
So you question everything, you've seen through everything through the emptiness thread, or you see clearly it's just a projection of my mind when you're on the psyche thread. But there's always this one thing you don't question. And that's like the core identity. You don't even think about it, could be different. And for me, that was this again, like Sabina said, I don't want to be here. And when I realized, no, this is just another projection, that was a huge shift. It was really hysterical. I had hysterical laughter. Then, I mean, it was a tremendous shift in identity, but also like in worldview, like what thought I was and what the world is. The whole thing just crumbled down, and after that, there was a lot of stillness, and that was the only time in my process when there were nearly no thoughts. I had a few weeks without thoughts. Just the thinking stopped when that went away. That was really interesting. But then another part that I wasn't aware of was this wounded child. I think that's also something that many people experience, that this wounded child, like the inner child, is something that is not questioned to be a projection because I lived through it. That's my experience, that's my past, and you don't question it. And that also, when that was coming up for me, that's something about braiding. I was inquiring with the feathers into reactivity 4 and 5 when suddenly the child showed up. And it was interesting to see that the reactivity that you inquire on the emptiness thread when you look into reactivity was the protection mechanism for the child. And when the protection mechanism fall away, the child suddenly wasn't there anymore because they were just intertwined, the two of them, and the whole thing just fell off. And I could see that also the child and all the trauma and all the pain, like everything that was so dear to me because that was my life, was gone. I couldn't find it anymore. That was another huge shift for me. And the last shift on the Psyche thread was when the surrenderer went away. So you asked to whom do you surrender? There has always been a surrenderer. There has always been something here that would surrender. And then the surrenderers wasn't here anymore. There was still surrendering happening, but there was no one left that surrendered. So also this became non-dual. There was not something that surrenders and another thing you could surrender to, but the whole thing just collapsed into one, and there was nothing left again. And I guess this is my bottom of the Psyche thread.
Yeah. So I've said this, all of the threads eventually land in some kind of non-duality, but the non-duality is different or expressed differently depending on how you got there through which thread. But yeah, once you discover that everything is a projection of the psyche, then if every last experience, every last shred of phenomena are projections, then that is a non-dual kind of um, realization, right? It's a because there is no there's nothing that is not the projection. Even the viewer of the projection is itself a projection, right? So there's nothing standing apart from that, from the psyche. Um, so I think I don't know, Yvonne, it sounds like maybe you didn't encounter this abyss or this fear gate that Sabina was talking about earlier, this kind of like tunnel of darkness or sea of darkness, you said. Like I had a very kind of visceral experience of that kind of tunnel of darkness that really uh, core fears, um, core resistance coming up. And for many people, it feels like this dark hole or this dark um, ocean or this dark void of some abyss of some kind that you're falling into. For me, it was very a lot of terror, a lot of sort of like approaching it in terror and then coming back, retreating and approaching it again and retreating and eventually gaining the strength to be able to like, jump in. Um, was anything like that in your experience, Yvonne, or how did you have these kinds of fear gates or these?
When you just mentioned the last thing, that this abyss and then stepping back and forward and dancing with it, that's been my whole life. So my whole life has been, I guess my whole life has been standing in front of that abyss and
Mhm.
fighting, like I said before, like the resistance would, I would always fight with this. I died many, many, many times in this process. There has not been one time that I can nail down and say, this is the time when I died. I died so many times and I jumped into the unknown. And like Sabina said, like when you're at that point that you don't care about dying anymore, you don't care about your fears, you're just like, I'm done with it. And that happened many, many times for me in this whole process.
Yeah. What about you,
Mhm.
Sabina? For me, it was like there were a couple times. There's one that was really dramatic. So like I said, I tend to have these more sort of like condensed and more dramatic kind of experiences. So yours, it seems like yours was more spread out, Yvonne. What about you, Sabina?
Yeah, I'm the flamboyant type too, so it was quite fireworks, even if it was scary. A couple of times, I couldn't have said it any better. I've died so many times along the way, and at one point it was quite astounding that this dying was ecstasy.
Hmm.
It was no different. So I'm the kicking and screaming type too. So I would fight with this, wrestle with it, for days and on end. And unless I was, with my back to the wall, I would not budge. So, but maybe because of that, it was so profound that there was no difference between dying and life and pain and pleasure or whatever. It was all ecstasy in some way.
Yeah.
And yeah, that this existential fear itself could turn into that was quite remarkable for me.
Yeah, you're both capturing, I think, this flavor of the Psyche Thread that was very, very present for me too, which is kind of like a resolution of light and dark, or resolution of life and death, or resolution of these, these opposites. For me, because of the way that, my psyche was organized, a lot of entities and energies and so on and so forth. This was very, very much like the angelic world and then the underworld, and the two sort of like came together, and the different entities and beings of both sort of like were shown to be part of the same divine sort of whole. Um, but I think the theme, so we experience the specifics differently, but the theme I think is, this theme of resolution of opposites, resolution of the two halves of the psyche, right? The beautiful, divine, blissful half, and then the sort of like darker, traumatized, fearful half, and they sort of somehow throughout this process come together into some resolution. Um, so before we get to kind of releasing this thread, like what else do we want to say about the trajectory, the deepening, the surrendering that happens along the way, and then the the realizations that come. I feel like we maybe should talk a little bit more about the realizations that come sort of about the constructed nature of reality or the projected nature of reality. Like because a lot of people are in a psyche thread process at some stage of the psyche thread process. And for me, it was actually like this along the way, certain points in the process earlier on. I had a pretty strong, this worldview, or this ontology or this kind of like, assumption that, the experiences that I was having were reflective of reality, right? That because I was seeing this entity in front of me, that entity had some kind of reality to it. And I you, you could have argued I could have argued, what kind of reality it had. Maybe I'm seeing something, that's being filtered in some way by my mind, but it really did seem like these realities of the psyche, the unconscious parts of the psyche, when they come forward, they seem real in some way. My trauma is real. My ancestral inheritance is real. This entity in front of me is real. My suffering, over X, Y, or Z is real. My conditioning is real. Um, but at a certain point, whether it's early like Yvonne or later like me, at a certain point in in this awakening process, it becomes clear what's happening is the mind is kind of producing these experiences, producing these realities based on its conditioning, um, and you try to find, you know, what aspect of reality is not being produced in this way, and it turns out every last experience is somehow being um, concocted by the mind. Um, yeah, how do you guys talk about this? Because I feel like different ways of talking about it might be helpful for people to hear.
Well, I will sound a lot like you. For me, all of this was very, very real. I mean, these entities and whatever, it was real. It was the world that I was encountering or living in. And when it kind of was crystal clear that this was all a projection, this was a huge shock in a way, like a clarity, and and it took away all fear because it was clear it was just my mind doing this or my psyche doing this. So but it just came at the very end, like seeing, wow, this is all just made up by my psyche. So there was no enemy out there to battle or whatever, because it was clear that it's all just my psyche, and there were no dark forces I could be afraid of. So, and they actually, I've never been, attacked or whatever anymore since this realization just landed. It was just all over. So there was no way of denying that this was self-made. Yeah.
Hmm. For me, I mean, I had a Psyche Thread release, so talking about it already leads towards the release. But I found it very interesting to see how many times I thought I've seen through it, or I realized it's all made up. And then another fixation came in, and there was another, like I said before, another part of the identity that wasn't questioned yet. So yeah, some things were clear they are not real, like you said, and then there were other things I couldn't even say if they are real or not real because they were not even in question. And so that was the interesting part for me that until the end, until the release, there has been still things unquestioned in the Psyche thread, even though there has been all the other realizations about it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I want to let me jump on something there. Uh when we say that we see that these experiences, these psyche thread experiences were constructed by the mind, I wouldn't say that that means they're not real because um it turns out, when you do this exploration, that everything is constructed by the mind. You can't find any experience like at the bottom of the psyche thread. You can't find an experience that isn't being filtered, constructed, co-created by some layer of your conditioning or another. Like even the vision that I'm having, my visual stimuli are, I'm looking at something that's red, or green or blue or whatever. Like even that is being constructed by my animal body, my biologically structured eyes that are bringing those wavelengths of light into my brain and constructing some kind of experience, right? And so every last phenomena is being produced by my brain or my mind or my psyche in that way. And when the unconscious nature of that construction becomes conscious, it's like you look around and, well, everything is constructed. It's not just these entities, it's not just these experiences, from the psyche thread. It's every last thing. So for me, the ontological question of what's real and what's not real just like falls apart. The question is meaningless because you can't point to something and say, this is real, but that's not, right? When everything has that same constructed nature, what's real and what's not, like the ontology just falls apart. There's no way to say what's real and what's not. It all becomes, again, it's non-dual. It's a non-dual sort of like flattening of everything. It's like, well, everything is either everything's real or everything's not real, in which case the words real and not real don't make sense anymore, right? Um, anyway, that's kind of like how what one way I would language that realization.
Yeah, and it's great that you bring this up because that doesn't mean that there is nothing there. We just can't say because how the mind and the senses are, made, how the biology functions, it's all filtered, it's all produced by the psyche. So, but it is no longer turned into a definite, this is how it is, and it definitely exists or not exists.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't exist. That's just as off as saying it definitely exists, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So for example, even today when I'm working, when doing my work, the entity shows up because that's just how my mind is, conditioned that it externalizes entities or whatever. So there can be an interaction, but there is no overlay turning them into some definitive existence or non-existence. um, all of that has fallen away, but the mind still, is configured that way here. So,
Yeah. That's a great point. So, that will take us into the release of this thread. Yvonne, did you want to add something before we get
Yeah.
into release? Yeah. Um, I guess one thing I want to underscore is I think to come back to what we were talking about at the beginning, where if you're thinking about things like trauma and conditioning and so forth from the perspective of another thread, let's say from the emptiness thread in particular, um, everything's a concept. You see through everything, you deconstruct everything, right? So all of this material we've been talking about is just a story, um, can be seen through. And there's the presumption, I think, in emptiness thread centric styles of spirituality. There's a presumption that all the stuff we've been talking about here is illusory, will be seen through, will be processed, and will be released and will be like gone. And one will live in a place in an emptiness in an empty state, right? Regarding all of this stuff, and that this is kind of like a purification process of getting rid of all of this stuff so that you can be more clear in your emptiness thread awakening. So that might be true from a pure emptiness thread perspective. If you only ever had an emptiness thread awakening, that is probably how you would experience it. But if you've had a psyche thread awakening, like what we're talking about here, getting rid of this stuff is not the point. It's not possible, right? Like if you've actually gone all the way down the way that we have and seen the constructed nature and all of the layers, or most of the layers of construction that we're talking about, like how would you ever purge that out of the system? There's no way I can purge out of the system the way that I've been sculpted by my culture or the way that my thinking relates to my use of the English language. There's no way I can purge out of my system the way that my eyeball works with relation to seeing colors. There's no way I can purge out of my system the biological, chemical, ancestral, genetic, any of those layers, right? There's no way. Um, if the psyche thread involved past life experiences or other kinds of, spiritual programming or a mission that my soul was given, 1,000 lifetimes ago that I have to enact on this planet, whatever the layers of conditioning are that your psyche has brought forward throughout this process, there's no need to purge them from the system. Some of those things might get resolved along the way. I think that's important to notice. Like traumas, can fall by the wayside. Other sorts of, maybe ancestral curse or something might fall by the wayside. You might have some other kinds of, entities that don't come anymore. Things can sort of like um, resolve themselves in a way that they're no longer there. But the goal isn't to purge every last aspect of conditioning out of the system. Um, and expecting that would happen, I think, is kind of a misconception about what psyche thread work is about. What do you guys say about that?
I mean, first of all, you still have a human body, you know. The senses are there as long as the body is alive. So it's unavoidable for the conditioning to, being projected or whatever, the system to run its course. So, and actually, I don't even see why this should be purged. And one other things I wanted to mention is that not only when you have like just a empty one thread like emptiness, uh, it can elude yourself how psyche thread awakening could happen. For me, while the emptiness thread came up, the clairvoyant senses were black. I didn't see any entities, anything at all because the emptiness thread just took it all away until the psyche thread came up again. So here they were again. So this can happen too when you're braiding, for example, or
Yeah.
integrating. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, I hear this a lot, like what you just said, that people think that everything's gone, and then I don't know what we are then, this pure being of whatever, like a blank piece of paper, there's nothing on it, but that's not how it is. So it's not possible to eradicate all conditioning, and you completely lose interest. Why would you even? Like, what's the problem? You know? I mean,
Yeah.
like you said, if there's trauma, if there's things that you can solve, why not just do it? But then for the rest, it's so much more relaxing now with all the flaws and all, the things that this individual body mind system has. Why not? I mean, there's no problem.
That's the key for me. So the key, you guys said the key to this process is surrender, and I agree because what's happening is all the conditioning is coming up, and it's the resistance to what's coming up and the trying to frame it and trying to be, in control of it that is causing all of the angst throughout the whole Psyche Thread awakening process. And for me, the surrendering, you could also say welcoming this material to come forward, welcoming these parts to play their roles, welcoming, the conditioning to be there and to be free to operate autonomously without needing to be controlled by an ego or controlled by some kind of centralized self. That's more of the flavor of a psychic thread awakening than purification and clearing it out, right? It's a welcoming it in, allowing it to be there, understanding how it's driving the conditioning is driving everything. The conditioning, there is nothing other than conditioning. Understanding it can't be resisted. Understanding there's no point to to resisting it because even resistance would be a form of conditioning itself, right? The whole thing can just there can just be a relaxation and the whole thing can just operate. It can just be as it is freely. But yeah, if there are areas of unskillful, dangerous, um, unhelpful conditioning, those can be, reprogrammed through various kinds of practices. So we're not saying not to do that, but just a relaxation around I am this being is the way this being is, right? I'm constructed in the way that I'm constructed. I'm going to see things in the way I'm going to see things. I'm going to be the way that I am. And relaxing around that is the trajectory of this thread. What do you think?
And I also think that, at least in my case, the conditioning that is not so skillful is still here, some of it, and there is still no interest in changing it. So if you still think you have a controller somewhere in here that can control processes, it might even be helpful to do all the deconditioning in the trauma walk beforehand, because now it's like, so what? I mean, who cares? It's it's interesting to see that the relaxation is helpful in a way, but I also can see, I mean, we talked about this in different contexts, that sometimes there's like an autocorrection, like the system itself is like, okay, this is not a healthy like habit of eating or sleeping, and then it automatically just changes into a more skillful way. But for me, often the conditioning that's still here is still here, and it's okay, Nothing needs to change.
Mm. Yeah, I second the relaxation in this, and I like the term autocorrect. This is what I noticed too, that the system will do like autocorrections when without, like previously you plot a plan how you want the outcome to be and how you go about, and now it's just showing up and the system is doing the autocorrect. So and I even find that when it does, the let's say there are unskillful patterns there, and that they can clear out much easier because there's no resistance, there's no clinging to being attached to anything, or it is no longer attached to an identity. So the clearing away is also much, much easier.
Yeah.
That's what I find.
Yeah, so there's a conundrum here. It's maybe like an ethical conundrum, let's say, where um so the psyche thread is the relaxation and the surrendering into the conditioning, allowing it to be as it is. The ego falls apart along the way. It's seen to just be another piece of conditioning. The doer, the decider is seen to just be another aspect of unconscious conditioning. It just thought it was in charge, but it turns out it's just another part, just like everything else, right? That's all just sort of running automatically, autonomously. Um, and in my system, there is conditioning around when something comes up that seems to be harmful to other people. In my system, that's seen as, oh, that's not right. That shouldn't be there. Let's fix that. And so there's an autocorrect that takes place to fix that. And I can see that that is a product of my conditioning as well. That's not a product of an ego stepping in and saying, we need to fix this in order to be, the person that we thought that we think we should be. So let's fix this. It's more of like an automated process where it's like, oh, that's registered as being a problem and it's fixed. I use the metaphor of autopilot on an airplane where it just corrects itself for turbulence, right? Something like that. But that's because my system's built the way it is, right? Conditioned the way it is. I can imagine somebody else who doesn't have that conditioning in place, who's also running on autopilot, but doesn't have the autocorrect for unkindness to other people in place, right? Just running on autopilot, being an asshole and not having any kind of like filter in place that's correcting against that. Um, so I think Yvonne, your comment earlier is to the point, which is to say like a healthy spiritual system would want to bake ethics into the autopilot from the beginning, right? To bake it in, meaning like really like install some conditioning for kindness, for gentleness, for awareness of others, into the system so that you don't wind up at the end of this process being an ass, right? Um, but you might wind up, like you said, at the end of the process, just like, this is the way I am. I'm kind of rude to people sometimes, and there's no motivation to change that. There's no conditioning in the autopilot to change that. What do you guys think about that conundrum or that danger?
I mean, for me, because I never thought I was on an awakening path, but this was all about resolving trauma and getting, kind of along with life. There has been a lot of shaping of my being in certain ways. So, and it was a very long process. I mean, nowadays with all the access you get to different teachers and information, some people go through the process within a few years. For me, it was decades. And to me, it feels like all these decades of going through my own deepest stuff and deconditioning and all the things that happened that shaped me in a way that allowed me now to have a autopilot, like you say, that is conditioned to kindness, to being friendly and helpful to people. And sometimes I think if you go too quickly through the awakening process without having really a chance to clear up your system, then maybe it's more likely that you end up with all the conditioning that's still left. If you never looked at it beforehand and afterwards you don't care, that's what you get.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, same here. Long process, decades, and it was more about like fine-tuning the system naturally towards. I mean, I work in service of people, so there was never a question of wanting to deliberately hurt people or whatever. So the question never arose in a way. But I think it's a great advice to do to include a practice on your way that kind of like hardwires you to more compassion, or yeah, that can always be helpful.
Yeah. 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 So I think I think that's true. I think I would I advocate sort of, I have this thing on the Multidharma website, which is your essential toolkit of practices. And there's sort of like, these are the 20 practices, that I think are kind of universally, I don't know, they're all from Asian traditions, but they are the sort of like gold standard basic practices from across Asian traditions. And one of them, which I put as sort of like your most fundamental kind of practice, that everybody should do is metta bhavana, which is like a loving kindness meditation to sort of orient yourself towards being kinder to others. And I think that's something that can be done by anybody at any point in an awakening process, yeah, just to hardwire, like you said, the um, those orientations, hardwire them into your system. I think it's important too. So let's talk about release then. So, um, release for me, it's not very complicated. It's just what happens when you have seen and absorbed the full implications of the thread. Um, you have fully seen that conditioning is inescapable. Every last thing you could possibly say, think, do, or experience is always going to be conditioned. You're never going to be able to tell, reality, like reality versus non-reality doesn't make sense anymore, like we said, from an ontological kind of like, philosophical standpoint, because everything's constructed. Um there's no way of escaping construction. Even the viewer or the witness of, or the consciousness or the awareness who's observing the construction is itself also a construct. Um, so you've seen sort of like the complete non-dual nature of all of that. And you've understood that conditioning, will come forward, that maybe, some of it will be skillful, some of it will be unskillful, that, you're auto correcting as you go, all the things we've just been talking about. And then at a certain point, you just don't need to think about it anymore. It's like, okay, that's kind of not a thing I need to monitor, check, think about, or spend a lot of bandwidth um, focusing on. And it kind of just falls by the wayside. The thread is superfluous. It's done. The thinking about the thread is done. And so to continue to think about it is superfluous. It's no longer necessary to track all of that, and it just can be let go of. Um, and for some, that means letting go of the practices, letting go of the sort of orienting towards all of this material that we've been talking about. But maybe it comes up once in a while, like you were saying, Sabina, like oh, I see an entity, but it's not, it doesn't register as a big project that needs to be undertaken in order to get somewhere. It's just sort of like, that's just part of how this particular mind works. Sometimes stuff comes up. Um, Not really any big deal, right? Not really anything to note or get excited about.
Hmm. Yeah, and also what I found is that since this it was here, it was the trajectory of not being safe in this place here on Earth or whatever, in this plane of existence. And when the thread ended, this kind of like subtle monitoring ended. Like, is this safe now here? Is this moment here safe? Of course, if I would stand on on the street and a car would come, I would step off the street. But this like kind of like extra monitoring to make sure that I'm safe is totally out of the game. So it's no longer necessary and it's no longer happening. And and to me, like the thread needed to explore really the darkest shadow, and then seeing that even that was just an interpretation of my psyche. So for me, this was like the end of that and the end of not feeling, not wanting to be here or not feeling safe here in a way.
Yeah.
Hmm. For me, I mean, we talked about this, that the release of the threads can be more of a perspective of a certain thread. And for me, it was the Psyche thread that released the whole thing. And what was released was this idea that there is shadow and that there is shadow work to do, and there is a need to surrender to all of this. I still had this fixation on I need to do this and this is real. And when I saw that I made even this up, there is no need to surrender. There is not even a need to say this is shadow or not shadow. When the whole thing, which has my lifelong project, this has been the project for my whole life, dealing like allowing the shadow to be here, not resisting it, learning to be with the shadow. When this crumbled, I felt like betrayed. Like, where's my shadow? Where's my pain? What do I do now with my life? Because it's been, like I said, a lifelong project. And after that release, there was a period of mourning, old good times, because it was so familiar to be with the shadow. It was so familiar to be with the pain that I was missing it. It sounds kind of weird, but this is how it was. And now when things come up, the question to surrender or not to surrender doesn't even arise. I mean, there is no standpoint, there's no viewpoint towards things that show up. They just show up and get processed by the system somehow, but there's no one needed to look at it, to control it, or to take care of any of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. I think my experience is similar to Sabina's in the sense that there was like kind of well, both of you have mentioned this like last holdout, right? Like everything else can be seen as being constructed, but there's this last holdout. And for me, that last holdout was about it was about it was about trying to control reality, needing to have control over reality, but it was really about fear of not being safe, like what you said, Sabina, and the sort of like um the whole Psyche Thread project for me had a lot of fear involved in it all along the way. Every time there was sort of not every time, but like every once in a while there'd be this fear gate that would come through, and um I developed a lot of fear around letting go and surrendering and so forth, and it was always a struggle to do that. But the very last piece of it that was um kind of like the bottom, the most core fear, this I have to monitor every moment of reality in order to make sure that I am safe. When that was seen as being a construct, um, that there is nobody who needs to be safe or who could do the monitoring. That all of that was a unconscious kind of app that's running in the background in the in on the computer, right? And it just was a superfluous app that was running, just kind of using up memory and using up energy for no reason, referring to nothing, right? Because it just was seen as being this superfluous activity that didn't need to happen. Um, and I just kind of saw that and was like, oh, um, I don't need to do that. And just somehow the app got deleted right at that moment. And all that there was just like this little moment of relaxation of like, oh, ha, uh, feeling of freedom, right, from not having to do that activity anymore. And so there wasn't a lot of fear, there wasn't a lot of bells and whistles, there wasn't the whole drama and what did you say, flamboyance that usually accompanied these kinds of like, moments for me. That last one was just like, oh, ah, okay, carry on. On with life, right? Just carry on with whatever comes next.
Yeah, totally second that. The last one was very unspectacular.
Mm.
And unlike both of you, I ended on the emptiness thread. And when looking at the unconscious thread from the emptiness thread, it was more like seeing, oh, these are all made up stories. I made up all these stories. They never happened like that. They never did. And like poof, that
Mm.
was it. So it had a definite emptiness flavor to it, you know.
Yeah, that's something maybe we should come back to and talk more in detail about in another video about release because I that is something that's been interesting talking with different people is the flavor of the last thread that was on or the last thought before the whole thread release thing, the flavor of that coming from different threads makes a difference in how people experience the release, but also how they think about it later. So we can come back to that and chat about it. But yeah, so this was great. I mean, thank you very much to both of you for running through all of this. I think we did a good job. It's a big topic, so to get through it in 2 hours, I think is a job well done. So thanks for sharing your personal perspectives and personal experiences and your ideas with me. Is there anything we forgot to say or anything that we should add before we close up?
No, maybe the only thing that you always say with every thread is not everyone has a psyche thread.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
if you're watching this and you're looking into your experience, like, where's my psyche thread? You don't
Mhm.
have one, okay.
Yeah,
That's
that's right.
fine too.
Yeah, that's right. Awakening happens in all the sorts of different ways for all
Yeah,
sorts of different people, and this is just here for the people for whom this is their
exactly.
experience. Yeah,
Mhm.
great. Well said. Well said. All right. So, well, both of you are involved in translating Multidharma into German. You both run workshops and do spiritual teaching and guiding and so forth in German, but also in English. And you both have websites, and they're right there on the bottom of your little Zoom tiles, so people can find you and hook up with any of the activities that you've got going on. Anything to say on that or um,
Well, if you're German speaking, you can check out multidharma.de.
yes, that's right. Thank you. Yeah.
Yvonne created a beautiful website for the German material, and you can also, find if we do workshops or retreats or whatever up there. And yeah, but
Yeah.
like you said, we also work in English.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay. So,
Mhm.
Dankeschön.
Ja,
Schön.
danke.
Ciao.